My name is Don McCaskill. I teach in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. I've taught in the department for over 45 years. And so in that time, I've seen incredible changes that have taken place with regard to Indigenous people in Canada. The Department of Indigenous Studies was the first to be established in Canada back in 1969. And I came teaching there in 1972. The department, in addition to having an undergraduate studies program, it also has a master's program and a PhD program. We were the first PhD program to be established in Canada for Indigenous people. And it's based primarily in Indigenous knowledge, very culturally based. So in addition to taking academic courses, students also take what we call a Bamodzuin Atan Hitsario option, which is apprenticing with an elder and working in an Indigenous community on cultural events. So they also have to do a practicum field placement where they work in an Indigenous community or for an Aboriginal organization. And so over the years, as you can imagine, I've seen many changes, and what I'd like to talk about today is the fact that we're in a very different situation, I think, regarding the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. In the 1990s, there was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples done, and that had a big budget of about $56 million. Had a lot of studies that were done, wrote 5 volumes of reports, but that commission really didn't have very much impact overall on the situation in Indigenous peoples. Partly because the situation politically changed. It was set up under a conservative government of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and then by the time they finished the report, it was the Chrétien Liberal government was in effect. I think also because they maybe took the wrong approach. They took very much a rights approach in saying that Indigenous people in Canada require rights and made all sorts of demands and recommendations that the government was not prepared to accept. But the other major factor, I think, was that the people of Canada were not prepared to accept the recommendations of a report at that time. If you fast forward now to 2017, you have a very different situation. And that situation was that the media, the academic community, general public are now, I think, in a position where they're ready to allow Indigenous people to have an understanding of what's happening with regard to their situation. Or rather, the non-Indigenous people of Canada are ready now to be able to listen to what's happening to the Indigenous people in Canada in a way that they never have before. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report has taken that energy in Canada and has written a report that has a number of calls to action or recommendations, and those recommendations have, for some reason or other, have been accepted in the Canadian public and by governments and by academics and the educational system in a way that has never happened before. So it's a very interesting time that we live in. As you recall, anybody who's familiar with Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it talked a lot about a very dark history period in Canadian history, and that is the period of the residential schools, where Indigenous children were taken from their families, were put in schools that forbid them to speak their traditional language. There was a fair amount of abuse that took place, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. The children were told that their parents were heathen and savages and that they needed to become functioning members of Canadian society. They had their hair cut, their clothes were made into Canadian clothes. So what happened is that the graduates of those residential schools were not given the skills on the one hand to be able to function successfully in Canadian society, but at the same time a lot of the cultural heritage and language and traditions and ceremonies were taken away. And so you ended up with a group of Indigenous people that were confused about their identity and didn't have the kind of parenting skills that they might have had if they'd stayed with their own culture, and most importantly of all, lost a lot of their traditional culture, including the languages and the ceremonial understandings, the spirituality, the relationship to the land, the relationship with their parents and their elders. And so that brought about, as the Commission points out, a lot of dysfunction within the Indigenous communities. And so the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, pointed out and did an excellent analysis of all the evils of the residential schools, including the fact that many of the children died of malnutrition, of other problems, and of the abuse that took place. And so they made a number of recommendations that would allow Canadian society to come to grips with and eventually to reconcile over a long period of time with Indigenous people. And so the governments have taken into consideration those recommendations and have made a major attempt to implement those recommendations or those calls to action. So that, for example, the educational system has agreed to implement Indigenous content into the curriculum all the way from K all the way up to grade 12. And post-secondary institutions like universities and colleges have agreed to incorporate Indigenous content into their courses. And some universities have actually required all students in the university to take a course that relates to Indigenous people so they have some content. There's also changes in the child welfare system that have been recommended because there was a lot of children apprehended after the residential schools were closed in what's called the 60 Scoop. They were adopted out by non-Indigenous people or put into foster homes and had experienced a lot of difficulty as a result of those events. And so that one of the series of recommendations that the TRC has made is to make changes in the child welfare system as well. So for some reason or other, the report has been accepted in a way that no other report has been accepted. And major changes are occurring. Now, there are other things, of course, occurring at the same time. Or the Idle No More movement had started and has made some inroads in terms of bringing awareness of the situation of Indigenous people to Canadians through various actions that they took. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has particularly been effective in terms of bringing about some changes. And I think that in the next few years we're going to see an awareness of Indigenous people and a recognition of the past injustices and some resources put towards rectifying some of those problems that were in the past, and that we're going to see a major shift and a revitalization of traditional Aboriginal culture, which has actually been taking place over the last 20 years or 30 years. And so we will see major changes, and I think for the positive, happening in the next few years with regard to the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people.